Lowy Institute board members, high commissioners, senators, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to this conversation with my friend, the Right Honourable David Lammy, the UK Foreign Secretary. I'm Michael Fullilove. I'm the Executive Director of the Lowy Institute. Thank you all for coming out on a rainy Saturday. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which the Institute stands, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders. Ladies and gentlemen, it's impossible to think of two countries with more in common than Australia and the United Kingdom. We share a language, a history, and a sense of humour. We're both old democracies and free societies. Our servicemen and women have fought alongside each other from the Boer War to the Iraq War. And Australians feel very warm towards the United Kingdom. In this year's Lowy Institute poll, 85% of Australians said they trust the UK to act responsibly in the world. As David knows, as a practising politician, 85% is a good number. Our country's strategic interests are also interlinked. We trade with each other, we do business with each other, our diplomats work closely together. In the secret world, we share intelligence through the Five Eyes. And perhaps most significantly, Ocus is a signal of our country's shared ambition to shape our environment and contribute to a stable balance of power. In this context, it's a real pleasure to welcome David Lammy to the Institute. I interviewed David last May when he was in opposition, and one point I made to him was that the last time a Labor Foreign Secretary visited Australia was 1966. He promised that he would break that streak, so thank you, David, for keeping your promise, and I'm taking credit for your visit. David was elected as the member for Tottenham in 2000, so he recently marked his quarter century in Parliament, hard Labor. He served in a number of portfolios in the Blair and Brown governments and in opposition, and after Keir Starmer's impressive win last year, David was appointed Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs. David and I will have a conversation on stage. There will be an opportunity for some questions from the audience, so please start to think about some questions. In the meantime, please join me in welcoming David Lammy to the stage.
Thank you.
All right, David, as I said, I interviewed you in May last year in a studio on Leicester Square. You were in opposition. There was a lot of excitement on the Labor side. Since then, my life has been pretty much the same. Yours hasn't. And I remember one thing you said to me when I interviewed you was that when you were a kid, you didn't actually leave the N17 postcode in North London that much. Now you do. Now you're travelling around the world, you're representing your country. What has surprised you about the last year? What do you enjoy the most? What's the toughest bit of the job?
So I think the privilege of being Foreign Secretary, particularly in a country like the UK, is a sort of skill and attribute that people tend not to think about enough. And that is that you do travel the world, but you listen. You know, you sit in places and you listen to what people are saying to you. And that's a great privilege when you think about the range of cultures, people, issues, problems that exist in the world. Sometimes it's humbling. You know, I remember sitting in Chad on the border of Sudan with a group of 5 women who had fled their village being burnt out and terrible atrocities, and just sitting with them and being hugely moved emotionally about the crisis there. But equally, the job has involved these heightened moments. And a few weeks ago, when Marco Rubio called me and said, look, the president has made a decision to hit the Fordo site in Iran, that was obviously a heightened moment of tension, where the world is gripped and hooked. And obviously, I had sat with him just a few days before in Washington, D.C., and attempted to get the Iranians to see sense in Geneva the day before. So it's a job that's expansive, but the thing I take away most is the huge privilege of listening. Not just lecturing or talking, but listening.
All right, well, you're going to be talking today. You're not going to be listening too much. I'm going to come back to Iran and the United States and the administration. But let me maybe just start with the Australia relationship, seeing as you're here and you've broken that streak. Yesterday, you participated in the...
I've got to tell you, by the way, I am shocked that it's 1966 since the Labour Foreign Secretary was here, and I'm determined to come back during my period as Foreign Secretary so I can say I did it twice,
right,
so that nobody can beat me.
Right. Well, I'm going to take credit for that secretarism too. All right, so let me ask you, yesterday you had your discussions with your Defence Secretary colleague and with Penny Wong and Richard Marles, and the big announceable was a 50-year bilateral Ocus treaty, which is great, but it's also unusual because Ocus is a trilateral deal. So what was the point of Australia, what was the thinking behind Australia and the UK signing a bilateral deal on Ocus? Are you coming to the rescue because the Americans are losing interest in Ocus or what?
No. We have, between our countries, a phenomenal shared history. We have live, as we speak, an intelligence capability that keeps the world safe and is another huge privilege of the role that I do on behalf of the intelligence community in the UK, working in partnership with Australia. And of course, we also have this phenomenal military capability. And the deal that the Defence Secretary has signed today, in the end, is about 20,000 jobs between our two countries, and it sets up a partnership way beyond the generation in this room. So that's what it's about. But of course, it involves our fundamental partnership with the United States, and the capability that exists across our three nations.
We know that the Pentagon's in the middle of a review into AUKUS. How would you make the argument to the Americans as to why AUKUS makes sense for them? And also, how would you make the argument about why it makes sense for Australia to have nuclear-powered submarines to those on the left in Australia who might say, well, why do we want to get into this? Why do we want to quicken our connections with the Americans at this time? Why does it make sense?
The first thing to say is all governments do reviews and should do reviews, particularly when they involve big aspects of procurement and defence, and particularly because we are having this interview at a heightened moment, clearly, of security and defence issues globally. We just had Stephen Ludgrove look carefully at AUKUS. The Australian government did this in their first administration, and of course, it's right that the Trump administration do a review and flush out any issues for them. I think that this is important, in part because of the importance of the Indo-Pacific region. Two, because in reflecting on the capability across our three nations, we should be minded to ensure that we are sharing technological benefit across our countries, bringing down barriers, and for Australia having stealth capability, I think is a fundamental for security in this region. this is a phenomenal country with phenomenal skills, both in tech and in defence, but it's in a a neighbourhood with challenges, and so for all of those reasons, with Australia clearly with two central security relationships with the United States and the UK, I think that this is the right capability. And I also think behind this, as I say, are communities in places like Perth, places like Barrow, and a whole supply chain that ensures young people and families have employment for years ahead and play a big role, as they have done in the past, in not just keeping our own people safe, but keeping the neighbourhood and the global community safe.
All right, I want to ask you a few questions about the United States, which is the key security guarantor both for your country and for mine. President Trump has just landed in Scotland. It seems to me that the Brits have been pretty effective in building a relationship with President Trump. We know that he likes the Royals. Keir Starmer has established a rapport. I know that you've had a relationship with JD Vance for some time. Peter Mandelson has pulled off a sort of a neat tariff deal. I saw that President Trump said of Mandelson the other day, he's a good-looking fellow, which I guess is nice. So you seem to be at the front of the pack. We're in a different position. As you may know, Prime Minister Albanese hasn't met President Trump yet. The Americans haven't appointed an ambassador to Australia. I think we need your help. What's your advice on establishing a relationship with the Trump administration?
Australia doesn't need the UK's help and doesn't need my advice. Some of this is about cycles. I remember when I was sitting with President Trump. He wasn't president at that stage, but I was with Keir Starmer in Trump Tower back in September of last year. And we were having a meal in Trump Tower, and he was obviously focused and hoping that he would win the election in the United States. But we had won our election in the UK, and he was really focused on the numbers, how we had won, how we had centred growth and migration as central issues, and how we had appealed to parts of the industrial north that we had lost previously. Obviously, it is the case when you look across the world that I think of Germany, Australia's in a similar place where their election cycle was such that when you're in an election cycle, it sort of takes you out for several months, and the folk are focused on what's going on at home, and then you look up and assess the world around you. So we were fortunate that our election cycle was such that we were in post, we were engaged with Donald Trump, but we were engaged with him out of office. And, governments always appreciate it when you're engaging with them and they're not in office. They have no power. Not everyone's knocking on their door, and you were knocking on their door, and we were fortunate. Keir Starmer asked me back in May of 2024 to do a little tour of the States, to speak to both campaigns, and then to come back and report back as to what I had found and what my assessment was of who would win the election. And I said to him that I felt at that time, I've been a student of US politics, as you know, for some time, that it was my judgment that Donald Trump would win. I did not think that what I heard about the Democratic campaign felt to me to be quite on the money, and it turned out to be right. So I don't need to give Australia advice. What has happened in this election cycle in Australia is extraordinary. It's history making. That in of itself will be of interest and is of interest, I think,
Because President Trump likes
globally, he likes winners.
Yeah.
The numbers are phenomenal, and he's an Anglophile. He's actually there was some commentary that had Kamala Harris won the election, she would have been the first U.S. president who had very little sensibility of the UK and the kind of the Anglophile sphere. Donald Trump is not that. He has a powerful sense. Starts with his Scottish mother. He talks about her a lot. Mm-hmm. He's there in Scotland today. I think Australia will feel a kind of embrace. There's a sort of familiarity, notwithstanding the day-to-day of politics and all the rest of it.
All right, let me ask you about J.D. Vance, because you've had an unusual perspective. I think you met him at the Munich Security Conference. I think it was last year. I think when I first met you, you were on a stage with J.D.
It was before that, actually.
Year before that, all right. What are your impressions of him? Because he's obviously an interesting interlocutor.
J.D. is one of those politicians who clearly has a public persona, but his private persona is very personable. He has a fierce intellect. He went to Yale. He's a very bright guy, very curious, very interesting. He's young, he's 40 and has achieved the giddy heights of vice president. And what I think our connection is, we both come from very humble working class backgrounds. We both have aspects of, not just working class, but my father had a problem with alcohol. JD had a mother with addiction issues. So dysfunction, overcoming aspects of real challenge in our backgrounds, and he's got a powerful Christian faith, as have I, and so there's a bond, and my politics has always been on the moderate end of the Labour family, and I'd like to think that people would say in the Westminster Village, I don't always agree with David Lammy, but he's a nice guy, and I'm able to forge friendships beyond my political tribe, and so he's definitely one to watch.
Let me ask you about defence spending in Europe, because I think this is a success that we do have to chalk up to President Trump. A lot of presidents have been trying to get NATO allies to step up. The UK was an early mover. You made some announcements at the beginning of the year, and then you were at The Hague when almost all of the NATO allies agreed to go to 5%. One thing that has struck me in the aftermath of the Ukraine war is often some of the strongest opponents of President Putin's actions in Ukraine have actually been from the left. Yourself, President Biden, from the Nordics. It's not always natural for politicians from the left to want to spend on defence, but it seems from the other side of the world that this has really changed the threat perception in Europe, and Europe is stepping up.
Two things. The first is, this may have been a subject of debate 18 months ago, 2 years ago, but it's no longer a subject of debate. And that is that those of us who are, maybe sort of 40, 45 plus, are so fortunate to have come of age in what turns out to have been the most extraordinary peace dividend. I remember 1990, I remember that period when the Berlin Wall fell down, when Eastern Europe opened up, a period where nuclear proliferation was on the wane. And then there was also this extraordinary period of rights breaking through and being extended, best personified by Nelson Mandela coming out of prison, and a whole era of possibility for women globally, for minorities globally. And you kind of thought that was going to go on forever. The world could never change. This is a wonderful period. And in economies like Australia and mine, we saw this emerging, growing middle class, an asset class, people owning their homes, having savings. That era is over. And we've moved now decisively into a new era. It has echoes of the Cold War period. It has echoes of the unstable periods in the early part of the 20th century. But of course, this is a new period that's defining itself. And sadly, and I see this every day, there's a generation of foreign ministers and foreign secretaries who are the people, we're defined by this train trip that we make. We land in Poland. Mm-hmm. We get on a train in an obscure part of Poland that we have never been to before, and it's a night train, and it's a long journey. And you get on this sleeper train, and you go through Lviv, and then on to Kyiv, and then you arrive in Kyiv, in a city at war, in a country at war, with sandbags around all the political buildings and institutions, alive to war in Europe. And so I suppose I'm saying that that is real. We are living through a multipolar world of competition across superpowers and autocracies that are partnering against democracy. Democracy under stress and challenge because of a cost of living crisis that really starts with the crash of 2008. And against that backdrop, yes, you have to invest in defense. And look, successive American presidents since Eisenhower have been saying, look, Europe's got to step up in its own defense. And yeah, credit to Donald Trump for forcing Europe to see the light in terms of their own defenses. We have to recognize the challenges that exist in the Indo-Pacific, and therefore any US president is going to be focused on the Indo-Pacific. And indeed, my friend Barack Obama was pretty focused on the Indo-Pacific and was saying that we're tilting towards the Indo-Pacific. But this is now very real, and it has implications for us in Europe. And of course, it will have implications here in the Indo-Pacific as well. This is a period where, and that's the second point I want to make, and that is peace through strength. That actually investing in defense is an investment in peace, because your opponents, those who might take a chance, might just have a go, realize that you are armed and capable, and step back and pause. And that's the moment that we are in.
All right, speaking of the Ukraine war, I was really struck by the speech that you gave last year at the Security Council. And I remember the Russian permanent representative or foreign minister was scrolling on his phone while you were speaking. And you said, and I'm going to quote it, "I speak not only as a Briton, as a Londoner and as a foreign secretary, but I say to the Russian representative on his phone as I speak that I stand here also as a black man whose ancestors were taken in chains from Africa at the barrel of a gun to be enslaved, whose ancestors rose up and fought in a great rebellion of the enslaved, imperialism. I know it when I see it." So what would it mean for the world if this act of imperialism by Russia were to succeed?
I'm reading at the moment and watching at the moment Man in a High Castle, which is a dystopian take on what might have happened had the Nazis and the Japanese in that era won the Second World War. And I always feel slightly guilty when a journalist says, "What are you reading for pleasure?" Because it's like, how serious is this foreign secretary? But I'm finding this dystopian take really interesting, and it's a bad place when big countries think that it's a good idea or they can invade and take over their small neighbors. And part of what we set up after the Second World War was a rules-based order in which that would not happen any longer. And if Putin's imperialist ambitions were able to succeed, like night follows day, there's a kind of domino effect across much of the globe. In South America, my family are originally from Guyana. Venezuela would quite like half of Guyana. Surprise, surprise, Guyana discovered a lot of oil 5 years ago. Venezuela are renewing, they want the whole half of the country that's got the oil. Thank you very much, says Maduro. And so this leads to a knock-on effect. It's got to be put down. And of course, if you're sitting in Estonia or Latvia or Finland, you're pretty acute to old battles in Europe and a kind of Russian imperialistic narrative that we have to guard against. And that version, those who would flout a rules-based order, of course, is not just unique to Europe. That is to be found also in this region of the world and other regions of the world. And we need to fight hard to keep that rules-based order going.
The institution that's often associated with the rules-based order is the United Nations. But I have been struck in the last few years how marginal the United Nations seems to be in all the discussions about the big challenges to peace and security. I mean, you and I remember during the Iraq War, you were in Parliament at the time, all the hand-wringing about how many times Britain and the United States had to go back to the UN Security Council. The UN Kofi Annan was really quite central to that debate. It doesn't feel like the United Nations is in that position anymore. It doesn't feel like Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, plays that kind of role.
Well, again, it goes back to what I said about a peace dividend period that has come to an end. So no doubt about it, the United Nations is a global institution under tremendous pressure and struggling because of Russia and the position it takes, particularly on the UN Security Council. But there are also challenges posed by China and its flouting of the rules-based order, particularly its attitude to the rules of the sea and the UNCLOS regime particularly. So it's an institution under tremendous pressure. But I say this, what an amazing invention came out of both the First and Second World War and the Bretton Woods system that gave us this forum where the world could come together, set up some rules, attempt to police those rules. The whole of the development architecture also has been really important, humanitarian aid. And I've seen that at work in countries like Syria. I was in Syria a few weeks ago, Afghanistan, those sorts of places. And so it's what we have. It's far from perfect. It's under pressure. But if we lose it, then we go back, don't we, to the 18th, 19th century. We go back to big powers, imperialism, might ruling the world. And I think might ruling the world is problematic for smaller nations. and would have big implications in this region of the world.
All right, you mentioned the Middle East, so let's come to that part of the world. And you mentioned earlier that the discussions you had with the Iranians and also with Marco Rubio about the strikes. A few weeks on, a month on maybe, how effective do you think President Trump's strikes were against the Iranian nuclear program, and how do we lock in the gains that were achieved through diplomacy?
Well, this is a live discussion. Today, there is a meeting which I brokered in a conversation with the Iranian foreign minister just over a week ago, where I urged him to come back to a negotiated path on Iran's nuclear ambitions. And I urged him, alongside my French and German counterpart, the so-called E3 of nations, to get serious about talks and about their nuclear ambitions, because if they did not, we would snap back on the JCPOA agreement that we struck with them, and that would hit them with global sanctions right across the UN system. And I'm very pleased that they are meeting today with our European technical team to get into those negotiations. And we are obviously linked with the United States. It's hugely important that Iran meets with the United States as quickly as possible, intensifies conversations with the United States as well. And the reason for that is because we are really clear. In terms of enriched uranium for civilian use, we've got sites like Sellafield in the UK, where the enriched uranium is between 3 and 5%. Why does Iran need enriched uranium of 60%? I mean, for what possible use could you need that unless you want military nuclear capability? And we can't have Iran have military nuclear capability. The assessment of the action that was taken by the United States is ongoing, and no doubt it's degraded Iranian capability to some extent. But it is also the case that once you have enriched, once the scientists have been able to do that in your country, then that knowledge is there. And by the way, we need to get the inspectors back in, and we need to know where that 60% is in Iran. So this is a live, immediate, serious challenge. It's a pressing challenge, and the UK is playing its part in ensuring that we sort this problem out. And ultimately, it's a problem that is best sorted out diplomatically, precisely because once you have enrichment, then to that degree, you need the framework to ensure that does not turn into military capability.
You mentioned Syria earlier, and you were in Damascus, I think, in June. What were your impressions of the new government, and how optimistic are you feeling about the future of Syria?
There are huge opportunities, but huge challenges in Syria. I looked into al-Shara, the leader of Syria's, eyes. I questioned him about a past that was a terrorist past. I asked him. I said, many people back home will say, you're a terrorist. You did some awful things. Why aren't you now the same guy? And he said, well, that was war, this is peace. I pressed him, as you would expect, to be an inclusive leader. That is creating a country where there is a role for everybody. This is a country, Syria's the most amazing, ancient of countries that has always had Jewish, Christian, Alawite communities that need protection. This is a country that he's now in charge of, where 90% of people are living below the poverty line. We have always in the UK been a huge donor to the Syrian people over successive governments, and we will continue to support them. I spent some time with some Sunni women who are agricultural workers that we are supporting there. The challenges are immense. I worry about the security and terrorism that exists in the country. And again, we have some work to do to support Syria to be a safe and secure environment, and to deal with Daesh and some of the really destabilizing forces in the country. So this is a big job that he has taken on. He needs to succeed because the alternative, I'm afraid, is a quagmire, is a sort of Balkanized Syria where jihadists can hide out, and that sort of country in the end washes up in countries like the UK, but actually here in Australia, Australia's had experience of this. It washes up as terrorism on our streets, basically, and so we need to be very, very vigilant and very engaged as an international community.
President Macron announced this week that France will recognise a Palestinian state when he goes to the UNGA in September. Was that helpful? What sort of difference would that make to the humanitarian situation on the ground?
Well, I think that the commitment to two states is fundamental. Two states that are able to live side by side with Israelis safe and secure and not worried by rockets being fired into Tel Aviv and hostages being grabbed in the night. But also the Palestinian cause is a just cause. And I worry greatly about those who seem to believe that we can either have no state or one state. No, two states is the way, and therefore my party, and actually this is a cross-party position in the UK, Palestinian recognition is a just cause. We desire it, but it's important that it contributes to those two states. And I think the debate about when has been about, is this a symbolic act, or is it actually an act that tips this towards two-state and towards these two states living side by side in peace? And the pressing issue at the moment, I think, is getting those hostages out. You know, I sat with hostage families, and the emotions of your loved one emaciated somewhere under a tunnel in Gaza, and the pressing issue is the horrors that we're seeing. The starvation, the malnourishment, children waiting for food, being killed. I think this is offending the global community. We need a ceasefire. We need a ceasefire, and we've been pressing the Israeli governments because we warned them that the aid system that they had come up with could not and would not work, and that is what is coming to pass.
All right, let me come to this part of the world. Let me ask you about China. You've mentioned China a few times, and you visited China as Foreign Secretary. I think all of us envisage a blend of cooperation and competition with China. Prime Minister Albanese was just in Beijing, where he saw Xi Jinping, and they had a warm conversation. But it's always complicated with China because at the same time that the world was watching President Trump monster President Zelensky in the Oval Office, Australians were watching in split screen as the PLA Navy circumnavigated our continent. So the Chinese are always pressuring states in the Pacific and pressuring us as well. So I guess the question is, from the UK's perspective, what is the balance between competition and cooperation in your relationship with China?
Well, we have had an oscillating policy towards China. It was only a decade ago that David Cameron and George Osborne, when they were running the UK, were declaring a golden age with China. We then bounced to different positions under Liz Truss, Boris Johnson. So we've bounced around in the UK, and what we said, and I formed this in opposition, is that we wanted a consistent position on China, where we would cooperate where we can, but we would absolutely challenge where we must. And there are a whole list of issues that we challenge China on. We challenge China on the political motivated imprisonment of Jimmy Lai. We challenge China on their espionage in the UK. We hugely are concerned about the sanctioning of members of parliament. We have big issues with transnational repression. I put out a statement yesterday on this, and the treatment of Hong Kong nationals. So we have very tough issues that I have raised continually with Wang Li and the Chinese. But on climate, world health, and of course areas of trade that do not pertain to security, these are areas where we want to cooperate and we want to do more, and we want to be able to have conversations with China that might lead to change positions on some of the things that we take issue with.
All right, let me ask one more question, then I'm going to come to the audience. I think you referred a bit earlier to authoritarian countries working together more closely. We've certainly seen the Chinese and the Russians, but especially in Washington, they often talk about the CRINCs, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. How close do you think that partnership is? How much of a concern is that?
Oh, well, I've seen it. You know, I've been in Kyiv. I've seen the shells that have come from North Korea killing Europeans. I've seen the kit, dual-use technology supplied by the Chinese. I gave the Chinese a list of companies that are supplying Putin with this stuff, and I sanctioned those companies. And we know Iran has also had a hand, and there are partnerships that are forged across boundaries. So this is happening as we speak, and we have to be really vigilant, really tough about that axis that is emerging. And then alongside that, we have real threats to our cybersecurity, and we have this kind of hybrid attacks on our democracy, stoking division in our democracies, destabilizing countries and their democratic norms and systems, attacking public institutions, bringing down and going after systems in all of our economies. So this is serious stuff. One of the huge privileges of being a UK Foreign Secretary is that we have, and this is something that I'm so proud that we do with our Australian friends, we still have, across the Five Eyes system, the best intelligence capability in the world. And I have huge respect for our intelligence agencies and the people that work in them who do so much to keep our people safe. And it's a huge privilege as UK Foreign Secretary to have part of that architecture that falls under the Foreign Office. And they do a tremendous job, and they obviously keep me pretty up to date with some of what these autocracies are up to.
And by the way, you've just appointed a new chief of MI6 who's the first female, she'll be the first female C, right?
Blaze, yeah.
Yeah.
She's going to be terrific.
And previously she was Q in MI6, she was a quartermaster.
She was.
All right, I'm extracting a bit of secret information here. All right, who would like to ask the Foreign Secretary a question? If you'd like to, I want to squeeze in as many questions as I can, so I'm going to ask you to keep it short and make sure it's a question. I'll ask this gentleman on the corner, if you could just wait for a microphone, sir.
Thanks. My question relates to this part of the world. We're on the doorstep of ASEAN. It'll be the fourth or third largest economy within just a few years. Indonesia is 60% of that. This is an area where we are lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and it screams enormous opportunity. I would love to hear your thoughts on what the UK and Australia could do to partner more in terms of seizing some of those opportunities for economic growth, but also for more defence cooperation. Thanks.
Well, that's a wonderful question. It was a privilege to be at the ASEAN summit a few weeks ago with Penny Wong, to be there for the second time, and to demonstrate the UK's commitment to the region. And in my visits to Malaysia, to Indonesia, to Laos, we are doing incredible things, particularly on energy and climate in partnership across the region. We're having detailed conversations around defence issues across the region, and a lot of those countries are wanting the capability and the support of our defence sector, particularly. And there are really good debates and discussions and opportunities around growth, leaning into higher education and skills in the UK particularly, but also the debates and the capacity that countries are wanting in relation to AI, quantum, those sorts of areas. This region represents growth, basically global growth. And we recognise that. That's why it's so important for me to be coming to Southeast Asia, and I'll be here again later on in the year. And of course, the Prime Minister Starmer, is pretty engaged as well. So that's a great question, and it goes back to this point which we make, that Euro-Atlantic security and Indo-Pacific security are indivisible. We, of course, in Europe are NATO first, but not NATO only. And I want to emphasize that. And the growth is important here, but also what we have is development partnerships, particularly with our Australian friends, that also make a difference, where we still have a big commitment multilaterally to development across ASEAN.
Senator Dave Sharma, Liberal Party Senator, caught my eye. Dave, if you just wait for the mic.
Thanks, Secretary Lammy, for your presentation. Your government recently announced cuts to the aid budget of about 0.2% of GNI, which I think is about £6 billion a year, or 12 billion Australian dollars, to increase defence spending. That's a tough thing to do for a centre-left government. How have you gone about communicating that message and selling it to the UK public, and how has that been received?
Well, thank you for the question. And let's be clear, we did not come into government with the intention of having to cut back on our development spend. And I recognise that there are governments in the global community who are making more ideological decisions to step away from aid. That is not the decision that we have made. We are committed to development, and we hope to get back to increased spending on development as our economy grows. But what I would say is this, that if you look across Britain in the post-war period, then the way to put development in context is to think of an accordion. And across that accordion, you have hard power, you have diplomacy, and you have soft power and development. And the truth is that accordion ebbs and flows really since 48, right through the Thatcher period, Blair Brown, and to modern day. And during the Cold War, we were spending less on development because we were spending, at the height of the Cold War, we were spending 7%. Was going on, on defence. And by the way, I've got to challenge those that say somehow that spending on defence doesn't also keep people safe. The war in Ukraine has cost the continent of Africa upwards $7 billion. This is a lot of money. It's a cost of living crisis. Affects much of the developing world. But we will still be the sixth biggest spender on development globally, even after the changes that we've made. But we are recalibrating. We remain committed to global health. I've just announced $1.25 billion in Gavi and their fantastic global vaccination program, not just about vaccinating some of the poorest children in continents like Africa, but actually moving the debate on, helping to give Africa capacity to build and manufacture its own vaccines. So we still remain committed to global health. We obviously committed to our obligations in terms of climate and energy. But the thing that people, African leaders raise with me particularly, leaders here in Southeast Asia, raise with me, is they want growth. And what they want is technical skills. They want us to reach in with our higher education capability, our tech, our AI, our defense capability. They want win-wins. They want us also to lead we're board members of the World Bank, IMF, those sorts of institutions. And so there's going to be more, I think, coming out of our technical skills in terms of development in the years ahead.
I think there's a question from Sophie Mack from Nikkei.
Thank you, Foreign Secretary. In June, you released a China audit saying that Beijing poses a full spectrum of threats, including cyber attacks, espionage, repression of Hong Kong people. And yet you also support the building of a so-called super Chinese embassy in the heart of London. And your British government also is amending legislation that will enable cooperation with Hong Kong over extradition matters on a case-by-case basis. Do you think these actions are incompatible with your own threat assessments, and can you guarantee that the 150,000 Hong Kong people living in the UK will be safe from transnational repression? Thank you.
Well, I urge you to look at the statement I put out yesterday, and the Foreign Office put out yesterday, challenging China on transnational repression. And because we take such a strong view of these issues, amending our extradition legislation in relation to this with Chinese and Hong Kong, because we are hugely concerned. We will always protect our people. This sort of interference in our country is totally, totally unacceptable. And we will stand up to it, as you would expect us to. I believe in diplomacy. And I wouldn't be here having this conversation if I didn't believe in diplomacy. And even amidst the huge global challenges that exist, the tough geopolitical environment that I've described today, for centuries, countries have sent diplomats to each other's nations because there can be no no-go areas. There has to be dialogue and discussion. just as we have an embassy in China, China has an embassy in London, and they're applying to change their embassy, to move building and upgrade their embassy. But let me be absolutely clear. I wrote with the Home Secretary in to the our planning system to make it clear and to raise that it was important that security considerations were understood and dealt with. And I did that in my capacity as Foreign Secretary, and the Home Secretary did that in her capacity as Home Secretary. These are not decisions that we ultimately would make. We haven't got those decisions to make. It's a quasi-judicial decision made by Angela Rayner, who is the Minister in charge of planning. But we will always do everything to make sure that we keep our people safe.
All right, I'm going to take the privilege of asking about the last topic, which in many ways is the most important, and that is Tottenham Hotspur. Because I know David is a member for Tottenham, you're a lifelong Spurs fan. When I interviewed you in May, you were a big fan of Big Ange, as you called him, Ange Postecoglou. He went through a difficult period, Spurs went through a difficult period, but came back, won the Europa League, and then Tottenham rewarded him with the sack. What did you think of the decision to kick out Ange Postecoglou?
I like Big Ange, big personality, did great things. I went to the Bournemouth game with Jaishankar, the Indian Foreign Secretary, and I realised then, because I was in the boardroom with Daniel Levy, that he had lost confidence in Big Ange and that he might not survive. But we won a cup 17 years.
Yeah.
So that was glorious. It was really wonderful for the community in Tottenham.
Yeah.
You know, having the parade down the high road, celebrating, you know. How can I put this? My love of Spurs and my love of the Labour Party mean that I do have to accept that over my lifetime, we're losing a little more than we're winning. But it's really nice to win.
Well, on that point, it's interesting you make the connection with Labour, because I don't know if you noticed, but Ange Postecoglou said after the win of the Europa League, he quoted Paul Keating, and he quoted Paul Keating's line from the 1993 election, which Labour won against the odds, and Ange said, this one is for the true believers. Is that how it felt in Tottenham?
Definitely, definitely. So the whole point of supporting Tottenham, you know, our phrase is to dare is to do. So we're known for playing, you know, electric, exciting, fast-moving football. Doesn't mean we always win, but we entertain. And that there's something in that in relation to representing this great North London constituency. And we have got another, you know, we've got another club in North London that some of you might know, Enfield Town. And, you know, and they're not bad either.
All right. Well, David, Spurs plays an entertaining style of football. You've entertained us this morning, so thank you for taking my questions on all these topics. Thank you for breaking the streak. We know you've got to go now. You're heading to Melbourne to watch the Lions win, so we wish you a nice evening, but not too nice, if you don't mind.
Thank you.
All right, and please come back.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank David Lammy.